We often believe that a home is built from wood and stone, but sometimes the true foundation of our lives is discovered only after everything else has been stripped away. A grieving widow and her loyal German shepherd arrived at a forgotten piece of land intending to sell it for survival, until the dog's relentless instincts drew them to a locked door, hiding a secret that would soon mean the difference between life and death. Subscribe to Shadow Trackers, and let us step into the mist to uncover the truth together. The autumn wind, howling through the Willamette National Forest, carried a bitter chill that seeped straight through the metal frame of the aging silver SUV. The year was 2024, but for Rowan, time had effectively stopped the day her husband's heart suddenly failed. With his unexpected passing came a cascade of financial ruin, ending with a heavy padlock on the front door of the house she had called home. Now, the only shelter keeping her and her 9-year-old son, Liam, from the elements was the cramped interior of their vehicle, parked on an isolated, overgrown plot of land in rural Oregon. This desolate property was her final asset, an inheritance from her grandfather, Rowan. He was a man who had lived on the fringes of society, largely shunned by the locals for his reclusive nature and his pack of fierce-looking dogs. Rowan had barely known him, and she held no sentimental attachment to the acreage. She was simply waiting for the morning to advance, clutching a thin cardboard folder containing the property deeds. Within a few hours, a representative from a local timber company was scheduled to arrive. Rowan planned to sign the papers, sell the land outright, and use the cash to put a real roof over her son's head. In the back seat, Liam slept beneath a pile of heavy wool blankets, his small chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Rowan watched him through the rearview mirror, her eyes burning with unshed tears and the exhaustion of countless sleepless nights. She wanted to promise him that everything would be all right, but her voice had lost its conviction. Beside the vehicle, a large shape shifted in the early morning mist. It was Bruno, a purebred German shepherd with a coat of deep black and rich mahogany. Bruno had been her husband's shadow, and since the funeral, the dog had carried his own heavy mantle of grief. He usually spent his days lying quietly, his intelligent amber eyes staring blankly at the horizon. But this morning, something had changed. Bruno was pacing. The heavy, deliberate impact of his paws against the damp, leaf-strewn earth created a restless cadence. He lowered his nose to the ground, taking in deep, rapid breaths, scanning the heavy fog that rolled through the ancient pine trees. He circled the SUV once, then twice, before stopping directly beside Rowan's door. He let out a low, urgent whine, a continuous, vibrating sound of distress that reverberated in his broad chest. He lifted a heavy front paw and scraped it forcefully against the metal door panel. Rowan rolled down the window, the frigid air immediately biting at her cheeks. She reached out to stroke his large head, hoping to soothe his sudden anxiety. She spoke in a soft, hushed tone, urging him to settle down and save his energy. But Bruno refused the comfort. He pulled away from her touch, took a few steps toward the rear of the property, and stopped to look over his shoulder, checking to see if she was following. When she did not move, Bruno's frustration escalated. A sharp, booming bark shattered the quiet solitude of the forest. The sound was commanding and authoritative, echoing through the dense canopy of branches overhead. He barked again, louder this time, his entire body tensed like a coiled spring. Fearing the noise would wake Liam, Rowan quickly opened the car door and stepped out into the damp grass. She pulled her heavy knit cardigan tighter around her shoulders. She called his name, ordering him to return to her side, but the German shepherd completely ignored the command. Instead, seeing that he finally had her attention, Bruno trotted purposefully into the thickest part of the overgrowth. Rowan had no choice but to follow. She pushed her way through tangled blackberry brambles and wet ferns, her boots sinking into the soft, muddy ground. She navigated the misty terrain until the silhouette of a structure materialized in the gray light. It was a dilapidated wooden shed, standing isolated near the edge of the property line. The red paint had long since peeled away, leaving the rotting timber exposed to decades of harsh Oregon weather. Bruno was standing on his hind legs, his front paws pressing heavily against the scarred wooden door. He was scratching frantically at the wood, his claws tearing away soft splinters. Rowan approached cautiously. She noticed a heavy iron latch securing the door, held firmly in place by a rusted, immovable padlock. Bruno dropped to all fours and turned to face her. He let out another sharp, demanding bark, then pressed his nose directly against the narrow crack between the door and the frame, inhaling deeply before looking back at her with intense, wide eyes. There was nothing out here but decay and forgotten history. Yet, as Rowan stared at the weathered padlock, she realized the German shepherd was not acting out of confusion or grief. He had found something, and judging by the desperate, unrelenting way he pawed at the rotting wood, he was demanding that she open the door immediately. Rowan stared at the rusted padlock, her breath pluming in the damp morning air. Bruno stood firmly at her side, his amber eyes fixed on the rotting timber door. His insistence was undeniable. She turned back to the SUV, moving as quietly as possible to avoid waking Liam, and retrieved a heavy iron tire wrench from the trunk. Returning to the shed, she gripped the cold metal tool with both hands. It took 3 heavy, forceful strikes against the brittle, oxidized iron of the padlock before the internal mechanism finally surrendered. The lock gave way with a sharp fracture of yielding metal, dropping heavily into the damp grass below. Rowan pushed the heavy door inward. Its rusted hinges shrieked in protest, the harsh friction echoing through the dense canopy of the forest. She expected a wave of decay, anticipating the stench of rotting wood and nesting rodents. Instead, the air that drifted out was incredibly dry and carried the distinct, rich scent of aged cedar. Shafts of pale morning light pierced through the gaps in the sagging roof, illuminating a surprisingly organized interior. While the exterior of the shed had surrendered to the brutal Oregon weather, the inside was a sealed capsule. In the center of the small room sat a massive, brass-bound cedar chest. Bruno immediately stepped past her. He marched directly to the wooden trunk, pressing his dark nose against the seam of the lid, inhaling the scent in long, deep breaths. His tail gave a single, slow sweep of anticipation. Rowan knelt beside the heavy piece of furniture. She undid the brass clasps, which opened smoothly, and lifted the heavy lid. What she saw inside made her catch her breath. The cedar wood had acted as a natural preservative, keeping the contents completely untouched by the ravenous mold and dampness of the Willamette National Forest. Neatly coiled inside were heavy-duty climbing ropes, a polished brass compass resting in a velvet pouch, and thick rolls of parchment. She carefully unrolled one of the large sheets. It was a topographical map of the surrounding mountains, but it was not commercially printed. It was meticulously hand-drawn in dark ink. Countless trails, hidden caves, and steep ravines were detailed with incredible precision, marked with dates extending back to 1985 and 1992. Beneath the maps lay several thick leather harnesses, their brass buckles still gleaming faintly. They were undeniably designed for large working dogs. Rowan reached deeper into the chest and withdrew a thick leather-bound journal. The cover was worn smooth from years of handling. She opened to the first page. The handwriting was elegant, written in the steady hand of her grandfather, Ron. She began to read, the words unraveling a decades-old misunderstanding. The townspeople had always whispered that Ron was a dangerous eccentric, a man who kept a pack of aggressive, wild dogs and vanished into the wilderness at all hours of the night. But the journal told a vastly different story. Her grandfather had not been hiding from the world. He had been protecting it. Ron had spent his life training his dogs for wilderness search and rescue. Whenever the local authorities gave up on a lost hiker, or when a storm was too fierce for the official rescue teams, Ron and his dogs would head out into the dark. He documented dozens of successful rescues, explaining that he kept his mission secret because the town feared his dogs, and he preferred the quiet satisfaction of saving a life over the loud scrutiny of public praise. He was a silent guardian of the forest. Rowan traced her fingers over the faded ink. A profound sense of awe washed over her. For weeks, she had felt utterly lost, drowning in the grief of losing her husband and the terror of failing her son. But sitting here in the quiet solitude of the shed, surrounded by the legacy of a man who found purpose in the darkest of nights, a small spark ignited within her. A heavy nudge against her shoulder pulled her from her thoughts. Bruno was staring intently at the leather harnesses resting in the chest. He let out a soft, eager whine, tapping his front paw against the wooden rim. Rowan smiled for the first time in what felt like an eternity. She reached into the chest and lifted the largest leather harness. The material was supple, heavily treated with conditioning oil that still carried a faint, earthy aroma. She held it out. Bruno did not hesitate. He stepped forward, lowering his head to allow Rowan to slip the heavy leather collar over his neck and buckle the straps across his broad chest. The transformation was instantaneous. The moment the brass buckle clicked into place, the grief-stricken lethargic dog vanished. Bruno's posture changed entirely. His spine straightened, his chest puffed out, and his ears stood tall and alert. The harness was not just a piece of equipment, it was a uniform. The working drive ingrained deep within his genetics had been awakened. He looked up at Rowan, his amber eyes sharp and focused, waiting for a command. Rowan looked back at the loyal German shepherd, her hand resting firmly on the thick leather of his harness. The crushing weight of her despair began to lift, replaced by a quiet, fierce resolve. They had come to this isolated forest expecting to lose their last tether to the world, but instead they had found exactly what they needed to survive. The low rumble of a heavy truck engine broke the morning stillness later that Saturday. Rowan stepped out of the shed, leaving the cedar chest open, as a dark pickup truck rolled to a stop near their SUV. A man in a crisp outdoor jacket emerged, clutching a leather binder. This was the timber company representative. From the passenger side, a young boy, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, hopped down, looking thoroughly uninterested in the desolate surroundings. The man introduced himself as David, apologizing for bringing his son, Ben. As a single father balancing weekend fieldwork, he often had no other choice. While David immediately began pacing the perimeter of the clearing, checking property markers and studying his clipboard, Ben kicked at the dirt, gradually drifting toward the dense tree line. Rowan was about to warn the boy to stay close, but her attention was pulled back as David approached with the sales contract in hand. As she reached for the pen, the atmosphere shifted abruptly. The temperature plummeted, and a thick, suffocating fog rolled down from the Willamette peaks. In mere minutes, the dense white moisture swallowed the trees, reducing visibility to a handful of paces. David turned to call his son, but his voice was muffled by the heavy air. He called again, louder, panic threading into his tone. There was no answer. He pulled his mobile phone from his pocket, holding it high, but the screen displayed no service. The dense canopy and atmospheric interference had rendered his modern communication tools and digital mapping completely useless. "Ben!" David shouted, his composure shattering. He rushed toward the edge of the woods, disappearing into the white mist before stumbling back out. "I can't see anything. He is gone." Rowan looked toward her SUV, making sure Liam was safely locked inside, then looked down at Bruno. The German Shepherd sat tall, the heavy leather rescue harness firmly strapped across his chest. He was alert, his ears swiveling to catch the faintest disruption in the quiet forest. Rowan did not hesitate. She ran back into the shed and retrieved Ron's hand-drawn topographical map. She returned to David, her voice steady and commanding. "We are going to find him. My dog is ready, and I have a map of these woods." She knelt beside Bruno, letting him smell a small woolen scarf David had grabbed from the truck cabin. Bruno inhaled deeply, processing the scent, and immediately turned his nose to the wind. With a firm instruction, Rowan gave the order to track. Bruno lunged forward, the leather harness pulling tight as he led the way into the blinding fog. Rowan followed closely, her eyes darting between the brass compass in her hand and the intricate hand-drawn map. The paper detailed hidden ravines, sudden drop-offs, and old logging trails that digital satellites had long forgotten. The terrain was unforgiving. They scrambled over slick, moss-covered logs and pushed through dense thickets of ferns. The physical toll on Bruno was immense. As a canine, he could not cool his body through his skin. Instead, he panted heavily, his broad jaws open wide to release heat into the frigid air, his breath forming thick white clouds. Despite the cold environment, the intense exertion caused his paw pads to sweat profusely. With every heavy step, the moisture from his large feet left dark, distinct imprints across the scattered beds of dry pine needles and brittle leaves. Rowan consulted the map. Her grandfather had marked a massive, hollowed-out cedar stump near a steep ridge, a natural shelter where a scared child might hide from the damp cold. She adjusted their course, trusting the faded ink over her own disorientation. A mile deep into the woods, Bruno abruptly stopped. His heavy panting paused as he raised his head, delivering a sharp, continuous bark. He pulled hard on the lead, dragging Rowan toward the base of an enormous ancient tree. Tucked deep within the cavernous roots, shivering and clutching his knees, was Ben. Rowan rushed forward, wrapping her heavy-knit cardigan around the freezing child. Bruno pressed his warm body against the boy's side, offering comfort and heat. Ben buried his face in the dog's thick mahogany fur, crying softly. By the time they navigated back to the clearing, the fog had begun to lift. David fell to his knees in the damp grass, pulling his son into a desperate embrace. Tears of absolute relief streamed down the man's face as he repeatedly thanked Rowan, his voice breaking with emotion. Rowan stood quietly, her hand resting on Bruno's head. She thought of the words her grandfather had written in his journal, explaining why he braved the dark and the storms. He had written that sometimes, true courage is simply reaching out a hand in the dark to help those who are lost. She looked at the shed, the open cedar chest, and then at her son, Liam, who was watching proudly from the car window. She walked over to the hood of David's truck, picked up the pristine sales contract, and firmly tore it in half. She was not going to sell. This forgotten plot of land, with its overgrown trails and weathered shed, was no longer a burden. It was a legacy. Rowan decided right then that she would stay. She would continue her grandfather's work, turning this acreage into a sanctuary and a gathering hub for a volunteer K-9 rescue team. After weeks of wandering, she and Bruno had finally found their true home. If this story of Rowan and Bruno's courageous journey into the mist touched your heart, please leave a like and share this video with someone who understands the unbreakable bond between humans and their dogs. Every forgotten trail holds a story waiting to be found. Subscribe to Shadow Trackers for more breathtaking adventures and tales of loyalty that echo through the wilderness. Until our next expedition, stay brave and keep tracking.